Hello, how is it going, sophomores? Oh, I need to fix my hair there. How do I look here? Good? I always look good. All right, so sophomores, let's get to our first road, which is Silk Roads. Now, we said Silk Roads and not Silk Road because there were many Silk Roads that were used for trading. And that's the big word in 2.3 is trade. What this does, it links up all these different empires and people all over Eurasia in the Silk Road. We see China, which is a major power, with the city of Xi'an, for example. They get linked all the way, trading routes that go all the way into Rome. So there's not one road, there's all these different roads that trade, and it's actually the nomadic people who are moving things back and forth on these trade routes. So the pastoral, nomadic people, the Huns that we talked about, who are able to get a lot of the goods here, the Shan Nu, who we talked about, who are able to move things back and forth. And the Silk Roads are very important because they make people of the world more rich. It also causes, which is very significant, cultural diffusion, the diffusion of religions like Buddhism here in Southeast Asia, Christianity up in here in Rome later, with more Mediterranean sea routes. But the Silk Roads are basically international trade routes that increase technology, bring a lot of new goods to people, and cause cultural and religious diffusion. Our next term, right around there, right there, is grain, alcohol, and silk. These were goods that nomadic tribes or pastoral people could not produce. Pastoral people could not produce grain, alcohol, and silk. They had to trade for them, and Chinese made these, and these were some of the big things that they were able to trade in China and put onto the Silk Road. Silk, incredibly important. Silk was so important that it kind of became like money. It was basically a currency that was used on these roads. Next are Oasis Towns. And Oasis Towns, like this picture says, they became the stepping stones of culture dissemination. These were the places where different cultures would meet. This is where, for example, Buddhism would spread. Mahayana Buddhism began to spread really rapidly because of Oasis Towns, because people brought their different ideas, and the religion changed, actually. Buddhism did change because of it moving around from different places and people taking their own interpretations of it. So in Oasis Towns, luxury goods like silk would come in, other goods would come in, but you don't just trade goods. When people start talking, they start exchanging ideas, and this would lead to cultural diffusion, which is a big word that we like to use in AP, but cultural diffusion is the mixing of cultures, the mixing of religions, and this is very significant because it happened often in Oasis Towns. Hey, let's get to our next one. Disease. Oh, it's over there, isn't it? I see it. Disease epidemics. Achoo! You get that? Disease epidemics? I sneezed. All right, anyway, disease epidemics. Let's get to that one. Disease epidemics were really the negative side of international trade at this time. These were diseases, plagues that could spread and could take out large numbers of people. Well, what happened is when people started moving from place to place and exchanging all these goods, they also exchanged germs. Let's take a look at this friendly picture right here. Here we see plague in Rome. Here's an example of disease epidemics that happened in the classical era, and it happened because of the trade routes, which meant germs came in, many times on rats, on ships, and these germs would come in and would kill people from it. And the horrible thing is that, like the Antone plague, this is the first example of smallpox, which will later come to the Americas and be devastating there, but it kills 5 million people. The plague of Cyprian, we don't know how many, but the Justinian plague kills 25 million people. These are absolutely huge numbers of people who die. This one is from the first instance of bubonic plague, which we'll get to more, which was a horrible plague that killed people. But these disease epidemics are the real negative side of trade. They're very significant because they take out large numbers of people and kill them. And they also, when these people die, it causes people who are lower them to be able to take their jobs, which actually goes against a lot of the stratification that was going on in the classical era. So these disease epidemics, they spread with trade. They killed large numbers of people, especially in Rome, happens in China, and many other places along the Silk Roads. All right, our next part is the Mediterranean sea routes. The Mediterranean sea routes really trace their origins to the Phoenicians, which is the Maritime Trade, which we see over here. They were the people who were, before the Greeks, who traded all over the Mediterranean Sea. And the Greeks came in, and the Greeks established their city-states where they opened up trade in the Mediterranean. And we see this waterway, which is a very good way to trade things all across the Mediterranean. And the people who became really controlled this trade were the Romans, who basically turned the Mediterranean Sea into a Roman lake. And what happens is, and this is very significant because this Mediterranean sea route trades were basically Greek culture spread along the Mediterranean, and then Roman culture and Roman government was able to spread all over the Mediterranean. Another side note is that Christianity also is able to spread on the Mediterranean sea routes and go to many of these parts of the Roman Empire when eventually, especially when Constantine turns the religion into Christianity. What edict was that again? Oh yeah, the Edict of Milan. Our next word is maritime trade. Maritime trade just means trade by the sea. Maritime trade was very important in the Mediterranean trade route, but also will become extremely important in the Indian Ocean trade route. Now, the Indian Ocean trade route will become a bigger deal in the post-classical era, but it begins to develop, and we're starting to see that there's trade routes that can happen over the sea. And slowly, these will start to kind of replace the Silk Roads. I mean, the Silk Roads over land will still happen, but people realize they can fit more stuff on a boat. You can get a lot of large, bulky goods on a boat and move them through the sea. So maritime trade will become more important as land trade will go down a little bit. Maritime trade really will increase in the Indian Ocean trade route and especially in the Mediterranean Sea trade route during this era. All right, our next term are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, as mentioned earlier, are an early sea-traveling people in the very early part of the classical era who established a lot of the Mediterranean Sea routes, enriching a lot of people around them and themselves. And their biggest lasting legacy is the fact that they made a phonetic alphabet with different letters, which weren't like pictures symbolizing something, but a truly phonetic alphabet of letters, which was then taken by other people, became Greek, and other languages took the phonetics from the Phoenicians. That's why they're very significant. Carthage was an ancient empire in a time period BC that was a rival to Rome. They ended up fighting in 3 wars. I'm going to do these 2 together. So also look at Punic Wars. Carthage was the main rival that fought against Rome. And they were a sea power that was able to rise and pretty much at the beginning was stronger than Rome. There was the Punic Wars. So in the Punic Wars, Carthage and Rome fought 3 different wars. Rome was able to eventually defeat Carthage in all 3 of these wars. In the last war, they even poured salt over their land and wanted to make sure that Carthage would never rise again. So Carthage is significant because it was a major power in the classical age that rivaled Rome and even developed more trade throughout their empire. They were very famous for their shipping, and their ships were some of the best at that time. Punic War was very significant because this allowed Rome to become the major power and eventually take over all the Mediterranean Sea routes, and turn the Mediterranean Sea basically into a Roman lake. I think we've seen this one before, but this is the Phoenician alphabet. Again, the Phoenician, early sail people who were sailing around the Mediterranean and other areas, and they developed the first letters that weren't pictures, that purely just represented a sound and were combined into words. Very historically significant, gets transferred to Greek and other languages, and many languages today, like English and Spanish, use phonetic alphabets that have letters that are based on original models that the Phoenicians made for their letters. All right, Greek culture. Greek culture spreads along the Mediterranean with the sea routes that the Greeks established, as they have all those different city-states that are establishing trade. Greek culture spreads, the language spreads, and then the art spreads as well. We also know, as we've talked many times in the past, that Alexander the Great from Macedonia who admired Greek culture, was able to spread Greek culture into Persia and many other places, and it later on influenced the Roman culture, which also took many Greek ideas, philosophies, art, theaters, and brought that into the Roman Empire. So Greek, while not being a big, strong empire, was able to influence the world more by their culture, also by democracy as well, and philosophy. All right, let's go to the next word. The Roman period. All right, the Roman period, again, if you look at this map, shows a lot of it. It is the time when the Roman Empire was basically at its peak, when they were basically able to turn the Mediterranean Sea into their lake. They had trade routes that connected all the way to the Silk Road, all the way to Rome, and that's why people in Rome, the big thing to wear was silk. And this was the time period where Rome pretty much had control of trade. They were at their peak of power. This was the peak of the Roman Empire, and they had laws and a legal system that went all throughout their empire. It's significant because many of these ideas spread to today, and it's also significant because Rome was able to dominate North Africa, part of the Middle East, and Europe in the classical era. Here we see our Indian Ocean trade again. And Indian Ocean trade, as it shows over here, some of the products, pepper, cotton textiles, dyes, were brought back and forth all the way from Africa to India to Southeast Asia. And merchants, were able to travel with the monsoons. The monsoons meant that sometimes the winds came in and let you travel here. Sometimes they let you travel out. There were these monsoons that brought these great waves, great rains and winds into India and out of India. So eventually people were able to learn to, if I go during this season when the wind goes this way, I can get to India. And if I leave later on, I can leave India, and it'll be easier on our boats. And that was developed because of the cycles of the winds in India with the monsoons. And that allowed a development of a huge trade network called Indian Ocean Trade Network. Important in classical, will even be more important in our next era, post-classical. Let's get to these next ones: pepper, cotton textiles, and dye. Pepper are spices. Spices become very important on the Indian Ocean trade route, will become very valuable in world history, especially for preserving food. Cotton textiles for clothes, and dye actually becomes really important for dyeing clothes, making them different colors. These are luxury goods that are traded on the Indian Ocean trade route and will allow places like here, like in the Gupta, for example, to make money off of this international trade. I'm going to take the next three words at once, and we're going to talk about the TransSaharan Trade Network, camel, and salt. This will be much more talked about in the post-classical trade, but we'll begin it right now. The Trans-Saharan trade started during the classical era. And what happened was traders used to try to take horses across the Sahara Desert. It didn't work too well. Eventually, when they domesticated the camel and were able to put saddles on the camels to ride them, they were able to travel across the desert, and they found that there was huge gold deposits in West Africa. To get the gold, they actually traded salt, and salt was very much needed before refrigeration, and the people in the West Africa didn't have the salt, so salt was often traded for gold, sometimes for the same price. So the camel was used to go across the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. Salt was traded to get gold, and that plugs in West Africa into this trade network, and it allows them to become part of an Afro-Eurasian trade network, all the way connecting the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes all together. In fact, coins from Africa are found in China and are found all over the place that were made out of gold. Very significant as this plugs in West Africa, expands trade, expands wealth, and gives gold coins, which will become basically like those will become the currency that will be used for trade over much of the world in the classical and post-classical era. Camels, obviously very significant because they allow trade to happen across the Sahara Desert with the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. That was a lot of words. Good job, guys. We do have some more later in the packet, and I will see you in class.